My sisters-in-laws laughed when I walked in alone, but then Groom's uncle bowed to me. I never thought I would be betrayed by someone I loved, especially not in front of so many people. But there I was, standing in the doorway of my sisters-in-law's house, watching as every face in the room turned toward me with barely concealed amusement. The kind of laughter that starts as whispers and builds into something that makes your skin crawl. My name is Ava, and this is the story of how one moment changed everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and what I was willing to accept. It was supposed to be a celebration. My sister Emma's engagement party at her future in-law's sprawling suburban home. I had driven 3 hours to be there, carefully choosing an outfit that I hoped would help me blend in with people whose lives seemed so effortlessly perfect. But the moment I stepped through that front door alone, no +1, no arm to hold, no shield against their judgment, I knew I had made a mistake. The whispers started immediately. "Oh, that's Emma's sister," someone said, not bothering to lower their voice. "The one who's still single." Another voice chimed in. "Didn't she used to be married? What happened there?" The questions hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and impossible to escape. But it wasn't just the strangers who hurt me. It was Emma herself, standing there in her perfect white dress, surrounded by her perfect future family, and when she saw me, she actually laughed. Not a warm, welcoming laugh of recognition, but something colder. Something that said she was embarrassed by me. "Ava made it," she announced to the room, and I caught the eye roll she thought I didn't see. Flying solo as usual. The room erupted in polite chuckles, the kind that feel like tiny knives. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, feeling invisible and exposed all at once. Every conversation I tried to join seemed to dissolve around me. Every smile felt forced, every greeting hollow. I was the charity case, the pity invitation, the sister who couldn't get her life together. That night, lying in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling, I realized something had shifted inside me. For years, I had accepted these moments of humiliation as part of who I was. The divorced sister. The one who couldn't make relationships work. The disappointment. But lying there in the dark, feeling the weight of their judgment still pressing down on my chest, I found myself asking a question I had never dared to ask before. What if I didn't have to accept this anymore? Will I choose to stay silent? Or will I take control of my own story? That engagement party wasn't the beginning of my pain. It was just the moment I finally couldn't ignore it anymore. As I drove home the next morning, my mind kept drifting back to all the other times Emma had made me feel small, invisible, like I was something to be ashamed of rather than someone to be proud of. There was the time she forgot to mention that her college graduation party was formal wear only, leaving me standing in jeans and a sweater while everyone else sparkled in cocktail dresses. "Oh, Ava," she had sighed, loud enough for her sorority sisters to hear. "I thought you would know." The way they all looked at me with that mixture of pity and superiority still makes my chest tighten. Or, when I was going through my divorce, calling her late at night because I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't figure out how my marriage had fallen apart so completely. She would listen for exactly 3 minutes before finding an excuse to get off the phone. "I'm sorry, but James and I have dinner reservations," she'd say, her voice already distant. "We can talk tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Not really. The worst part wasn't even the big moments. It was the 1,000 tiny cuts that bled so slowly I didn't notice I was dying. The way she would introduce me at family gatherings. "This is my sister, Ava. She's between things right now." Between things. As if my entire existence was just a pause between more important chapters. When I started my own consulting business after the divorce, working 18-hour days to build something from nothing, she never once asked how it was going. But when I finally landed my first major client, when I was so proud I could barely contain myself, her response was, "That's nice. Did I tell you James got promoted again?" I think what hurt the most was how she had trained our entire family to see me through her eyes. Our parents would ask her about my life instead of asking me directly. "How is Ava doing?" they'd say to her at Sunday dinners, as if I wasn't sitting right there. And Emma would answer with that same patronizing tone. "She's hanging in there. Hanging in there." not thriving, not building something beautiful, just surviving. I remember the Christmas when I brought homemade gifts because money was tight, and Emma made sure everyone knew they were so creative and so thoughtful when you're on a budget. The emphasis on budget, the way she said it like it was a dirty word, made every person in that room look at me differently. The emotional scars run deeper than I ever admitted to myself. Each dismissal, each eye roll, each time she made me feel like an inconvenience in her perfectly curated life, they all added up. They became the voice in my head that said I wasn't enough, that I would never be enough, that I deserved whatever scraps of love and respect people were willing to throw my way. Can I confront the hidden wounds, or will they remain buried forever? The answer came to me on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the engagement party, while I was sitting in my home office reviewing a client proposal. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Emma wants to know if you're bringing anyone to the wedding. She needs final numbers for the caterer. Not, how are you doing, sweetheart? Not, Emma asked me to check with you about the wedding. Just a message that reduced me to a logistical problem to be solved. A number to be counted or not counted. I stared at that text for 10 minutes, feeling the familiar knot form in my stomach, the automatic response of shame and inadequacy rising like bile in my throat. And then something snapped. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but quietly, like a thread that has been pulled too tight for too long finally breaking. I set my phone down and walked to my bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was tired. Her eyes held too much sadness, her shoulders carried too much weight. But she was also successful, intelligent, capable. She had built a thriving business from nothing. She had survived a divorce that would have broken some people. She had weathered every storm life had thrown at her and was still standing. Why was I allowing Emma to define my worth? Why was I giving her the power to make me feel small when I had accomplished so much on my own? I thought about all the times I had bitten my tongue, swallowed my pride, accepted her cruelty because she was family, because keeping the peace was easier than standing up for myself, because I had convinced myself that love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection people were willing to give me. But this wasn't love. This was a pattern of emotional abuse disguised as sibling rivalry, and I had been complicit in it by staying silent. I picked up my phone and typed back, "Tell Emma I'll let her know about my +1 when I'm ready. And Mom, next time she has a question for me, she can ask me directly." The message felt like a small act of rebellion, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I wasn't apologizing for taking up space or asking for basic respect. That evening, I opened my laptop and started researching Emma's fiancé's family business. If I were going to that wedding, I was going to walk in with my head held high, armed with knowledge and confidence. I was done being the victim in this story. I called in favors from clients, researched connections, and slowly began to see a web of possibilities I had never noticed before. Emma thought she knew everything about me, but she had underestimated what I was capable of when I stopped hiding my light to make her feel brighter. The scared, diminished version of myself that had stood in that doorway was still there, but she was no longer in control. I was taking the wheel. Can I find the courage to change my life, or will I hesitate when it matters most? 3 weeks of research had given me something I hadn't expected: leverage. Emma's future father-in-law, Richard Hartwell, wasn't just a successful businessman. He was desperate. His company was hemorrhaging money due to a series of poor investments, and he was quietly looking for someone to help restructure his operations before the whole empire collapsed. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had laughed at me walking in alone, who had whispered about my failed marriage and uncertain future, needed exactly what I'd spent the last 5 years building. My consulting firm specialized in corporate turnarounds, and I had just successfully saved 3 companies from bankruptcy. I sat in my office, surrounded by printouts of financial reports and news articles, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Powerful. Not vindictive, exactly, but clear about what needed to happen. The wedding was in 6 weeks. Emma had finally called me directly, the first time in months, to passive-aggressively ask again about my +1. "You know, Ava, it's really hard to plan when people don't respond," she'd said, her voice dripping with a familiar condescension. Richard's family is very particular about these things. I'll be bringing someone, I told her calmly. Someone I think Richard will be very interested to meet. That someone was going to be me, but not the version of me she expected. I had scheduled a preliminary consultation with Richard for the Friday before the wedding. Just a casual meeting, I told his assistant, to discuss some opportunities for collaboration. He had no idea who I was, of course. To him, I was just Ava Chun, CEO of Phoenix Strategic Consulting. He didn't know I was the sister-in-law-to-be who had been dismissed and diminished at his own dinner party. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would walk into that meeting as the successful businesswoman I actually was, not the failure Emma had painted me to be. I would present a proposal that could save his company, position myself as someone he needed, someone valuable. And then, at the wedding, when Emma introduced me as her struggling sister, Richard would realize exactly who I was. The woman he had just been courting for her expertise. The woman who held the solution to his problems in her hands. I wasn't planning to humiliate Emma the way she had humiliated me. That would make me just like her. Instead, I was going to let the truth speak for itself. Let them all see who I really was when I wasn't dimming my light to make others comfortable. But as I finalized the details of my presentation, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubts. Was this about justice, or was this about revenge? And when it was all over, when the truth was revealed and the power dynamic shifted, would I feel the satisfaction I was hoping for? Will I feel victorious when it's over, or will the consequences leave me feeling empty? The meeting with Richard exceeded every expectation I had. He sat across from me in his mahogany-paneled office, his desperation barely concealed behind his polished exterior, as I laid out a comprehensive restructuring plan that could save his company millions. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through my presentation, and I could see the moment when hope replaced panic in his eyes. "This is exactly what we need," he said, leaning forward with the intensity of a drowning man who had just been thrown a life preserver. "Your analysis of our supply chain inefficiencies alone could save us $2 million annually. When can you start? Let's discuss it further at your son's wedding," I replied smoothly, watching as confusion flickered across his features. "I'll be there as a guest." The wedding day arrived with perfect autumn weather and an atmosphere of expensive elegance that Emma had orchestrated down to the last detail. I had spent the morning in careful preparation, a professional massage, makeup done by an artist I had flown in from the city, my hair styled in an elegant updo that spoke of quiet confidence. I walked into the ceremony wearing a navy silk dress that had cost more than some people's rent, my confidence as carefully tailored as my outfit. The venue was stunning, a historic mansion with gardens that looked like something from a magazine spread. Emma had spared no expense, and I found myself genuinely happy for her, despite everything. This was her day, and she deserved for it to be beautiful. Emma spotted me immediately as I signed the guest book, her eyes scanning frantically for my mysterious +1. When she realized I was alone again, that familiar smirk started to spread across her face. But something in my posture, in the way I carried myself, made her hesitate. I wasn't the defeated woman who had stood in her in-law's doorway months ago. "Ava," she called out, her voice artificially bright. "You look different." "Thank you," I replied simply, offering her a genuine smile. "You look radiant. This is exactly the wedding you dreamed of." The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give her that. James gazed at Emma like she hung the moon, and watching them exchange vows, I felt a surprising peace. Whatever our issues, my sister deserved love. But it was the reception where everything unfolded. Richard approached me during cocktail hour, his face lighting up with recognition and relief.
"Ava,
I'm so glad you're here. I've been thinking about our conversation all weekend. I'd love to introduce you to some people. My brother is in manufacturing, and I think there might be synergies with your consulting work." "Actually," I said, my voice carrying just enough to reach Emma, who had been eavesdropping nearby while pretending to arrange centerpieces, "I think you already know my sister, your new daughter-in-law." The color drained from Richard's face as the pieces clicked into place like a puzzle solving itself in slow motion. Emma, who had been moving closer to insert herself into our conversation, stopped dead in her tracks, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Your sister?" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes darting between us, as if he were seeing us both for the first time. "Emma, meet the CEO of Phoenix Strategic Consulting. The woman who's going to save our company." His introduction was automatic, his business instincts overriding his shock even as his hand reached out to steady himself against a nearby table. Emma's expression cycled through confusion, realization, and then something I had never seen before: genuine respect mixed with fear. The dynamic had shifted so completely that everyone around us could feel it. Guests were beginning to notice the sudden tension, the way conversations were quieting as people sensed something significant happening. For the first time in our adult lives, Emma was speechless. No quick put-down, no dismissive comment, no way to diminish what had just happened. The woman she had spent years portraying as a failure was being courted by her new father-in-law as his potential savior. I maintained perfect composure, graciously accepting Richard's praise while watching Emma struggle to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the woman standing before her. But even as I felt the satisfaction of vindication washing over me, something else stirred beneath it, a question I hadn't anticipated. Will I feel relieved after this? Or will it leave me questioning everything? The drive home from the wedding was the longest 2 hours of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I replayed every moment of the evening, every expression that had crossed Emma's face, every word that Richard had spoken in praise of my work. The highway stretched endlessly before me, my headlights cutting through the darkness like my thoughts cutting through years of accumulated pain. I had won. Completely, utterly, undeniably. The sister who had spent years making me feel small had been forced to watch as her new father-in-law treated me like the successful professional I actually was. The same people who had whispered about my failures were now asking for my business card, requesting meetings, treating me with the respect I had always deserved but never received. So why did I feel so hollow? Why was there this gnawing emptiness where satisfaction should have been? I pulled over at a rest stop and sat in my car, still wearing my wedding dress like armor I wasn't ready to remove. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few long-haul truckers and late-night travelers. I closed my eyes and tried to recapture that moment when Richard had introduced me to Emma as his company's potential savior, but instead of triumph, all I could see was the look of genuine hurt that had flashed across my sister's face before the shock set in. I kept waiting for the rush of satisfaction, the sweet taste of vindication that I had imagined would flood through me when justice was finally served. Instead, I felt strangely empty, like I had been holding my breath for years and had finally exhaled, only to realize I didn't know how to breathe normally anymore. The truth was, seeing Emma's face crumble when she realized who I really was didn't feel as good as I thought it would. There was shock there, yes, and a grudging respect she had never shown me before. But there was also something that looked almost like betrayal, and that caught me off guard. As if she was wondering how long I had been hiding this part of myself, and more painfully, why I had felt the need to hide it from her. Had I spent so much energy focused on proving her wrong that I had forgotten to ask myself what I actually wanted from our relationship? Was public vindication really worth the look of confusion in my sister's eyes when she realized I had been planning this revelation for weeks? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my carefully orchestrated plan had been just as manipulative as Emma's years of subtle cruelty. I had used information and timing to maximum effect, just as she had used social situations and family dynamics to diminish me. We had both been playing games, and I wasn't sure either of us had really won. Back in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, still wearing my wedding dress like armor I wasn't ready to take off. My phone had been buzzing all evening with notifications, LinkedIn requests from people at the wedding, a text from Richard's assistant asking to schedule a follow-up meeting, even a message from our cousin Sarah asking for details about my secret business empire. But the one message I both hoped for and dreaded never came. Nothing from Emma. No angry text, no confused question, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just silence that felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. I found myself thinking about us as children, when we used to build blanket forts in our living room and tell each other stories until we fell asleep. When Emma would brush my hair and braid it before school, when we would share secrets and dreams. When had that sister become someone who felt like a stranger? When had our relationship become a battlefield where one of us always had to lose for the other to win? The revenge had been perfect in its execution, surgical in its precision, but it hadn't healed the original wound. If anything, it had torn it wider open, exposing questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer about who I had become and whether this version of myself was someone I could live with. Has revenge really brought me peace? Or is there more healing to be done? The answer came to me 3 days later, not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in the quiet simplicity of my morning routine. I was making coffee, checking emails, preparing for another day of running the business I had built from nothing, when I realized something profound. I had been living my life seeking validation from people whose opinions had never actually mattered. The realization hit me while I was reading an email from a client thanking me for saving their family business. Here was someone who understood my value not because they had been forced to see it in a dramatic revelation, but because they had experienced it firsthand. Their gratitude was authentic, unforced, and it filled me with a warmth that Emma's shocked recognition never could. Emma's approval wouldn't make my business more successful. Her acknowledgement wouldn't heal my divorce or erase the struggles I had overcome. Her respect, while nice to finally have, wasn't the missing piece I thought it was. I had been whole all along. I just hadn't been able to see it through the fog of her dismissal. The real victory wasn't what happened at that wedding. It was every client I had saved from bankruptcy. Every late night I had worked to build something meaningful. Every time I had chosen to keep going when giving up would have been easier. Every small business owner who called me their lifeline. Every employee whose job I had helped preserve. The real victory was the woman I had become, not in spite of Emma's treatment, but independent of it entirely. I picked up my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I called Emma. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed her number, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do, extend an olive branch after years of warfare. Ava. Her voice was uncertain, cautious, like she was talking to a stranger she wasn't sure she could trust. I owe you an apology, I said, surprising us both. The words came out steadier than I had expected. Not for being successful, but for not telling you about my work. For letting you go on thinking I was struggling when I wasn't. There was a long pause, filled with years of unspoken hurt and misunderstanding. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her processing what I had said. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice was smaller now, more vulnerable than I had heard it in years. Because somewhere along the way, I started believing the story you told about me. That I was the sister who couldn't get her life together. It was easier to hide my success than to challenge your narrative. It was easier to be small than to risk your disapproval if I dared to be proud of what I had accomplished. I never meant, she started then stopped. I could hear her gathering courage. Actually, that's not true. I did mean it, at least some of it. I was jealous, Ava. You always seemed so resilient, so capable of starting over. When your marriage ended, I thought you'd fall apart, but you just rebuilt. You became stronger. I could never do that. When things get hard, I fall apart. I need everyone around me to hold me together. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us had expected to find. It was raw and honest in a way our conversations hadn't been in years. For the first time since we were children, we were talking to each other as people, not as characters in some family drama we had been performing for too long. I didn't rebuild because I'm stronger than you, I told her, my voice gentle but firm. I rebuilt because I had to. Because the alternative was giving up on myself, and I wasn't ready to do that. But strength isn't about never falling apart. It's about putting yourself back together afterward. Richard hasn't stopped talking about you, she said quietly, and I could hear something that might have been pride in her voice. He thinks you're going to save his company. He keeps asking James how he never knew his sister-in-law was this brilliant businesswoman. Maybe I will save his company, but not because I want to prove anything to you or anyone else. Because it's good work and I'm good at my job. Because helping businesses survive and thrive is what I love to do. That conversation didn't fix everything between us. Years of hurt don't heal in a single phone call, and patterns of behavior don't change overnight. But it was a beginning, a recognition that we had both been playing roles that no longer served us. Emma was the perfect sister who had everything figured out, and Ava was the struggling failure who needed to be managed and contained. The real empowerment wasn't in the moment when Emma finally saw my worth. It was in the moment when I stopped needing her to see it. When I realized that my value existed independent of her recognition, and that seeking her approval had been giving her a power over me that she had never actually earned. Am I ready to move forward, or is there still something I need to let go of? 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of my expanded office space, looking out at the team I had hired to help handle our growing client base. The space was everything I had dreamed of when I first started the business: floor-to-ceiling windows that let in floods of natural light, modern furniture that spoke of success without being ostentatious, and most importantly, the quiet hum of meaningful work being done. Richard's company had been our biggest success story yet, but it was just one of many. Word had spread about Phoenix strategic consulting like wildfire through the business community, and my calendar was booked solid with businesses that needed exactly what I had spent years learning to do: help people rebuild from the ground up. I had hired Sarah Martinez as my operations manager, a brilliant woman who had lost her previous job when her company went under, and who understood better than anyone what it meant to start over. There was Marcus Chun, my data analyst, who had immigrated here 5 years ago with nothing but his expertise and determination. And Dr. Patricia Williams, my strategic planning consultant, who had left corporate America to join our mission of helping struggling businesses find their footing again. We were all people who had faced adversity and chosen to transform it into strength. Emma and I met for coffee now, tentatively at first, then with growing ease as we learned to navigate this new version of sisterhood. Our Tuesday morning coffee dates had become a ritual I actually looked forward to. We were learning to be sisters again instead of competitors in some imaginary contest where only one of us could win. She had started her own business too, an event planning company that was already gaining recognition for its attention to detail and creative vision. Watching her pour her natural perfectionism into something productive instead of destructive had been beautiful to witness. I used to think your success somehow diminished mine, she admitted during one of our recent coffee dates, stirring cream into her latte with the precise movements that characterized everything she did. Like there was only so much success to go around in our family, and if you had it, there would be less for me. I know, I said, stirring honey into my own latte and watching the golden sweetness dissolve. I used to think I had to hide mine to make you comfortable. I thought making myself smaller would somehow make our relationship better. We were both learning that there was enough light for both of us to shine, enough space for both of our dreams to flourish. Our parents had noticed the change too. They had started asking us both about our work, our lives, our hopes for the future. Sunday dinners had become celebrations of what we were both building instead of quiet competitions over who was doing better. The woman who had stood in that doorway 8 months ago, shrinking under the weight of other people's judgment, felt like a stranger to me now. Not because I had become someone else, but because I had finally become fully myself. The divorce, the humiliation, the years of feeling like I wasn't enough, they were all part of my story, but they were no longer the whole story. They were chapters that had taught me resilience, not shameful secrets to be hidden. I had a business card now that I handed out with pride, watching as potential clients' eyes lit up when I described what we did. I had clients who respected my expertise and colleagues who valued my insights. I had speaking engagements at business conferences, invitations to join professional boards, requests for interviews about my journey from corporate burnout to entrepreneurial success. I had a sister who was slowly becoming a friend again, and parents who had learned to ask me directly about my life instead of treating me like I was invisible. But most importantly, I had something that no external validation could give me, an unshakable knowledge of my own worth that existed independent of anyone else's opinion or recognition. The morning sun streamed through my office windows as I prepared for another day of helping businesses transform their struggles into strengths. My first client meeting was with a small family restaurant that was on the verge of closing, and I felt that familiar surge of purpose that came with knowing I could help them find a way forward. It struck me that this was what I had always been meant to do, not just professionally, but personally. To take the broken pieces and build something beautiful from them. To help others see possibilities where they only saw problems. I thought about that scared woman at the engagement party, and I wished I could go back and tell her what I knew now, that she was already enough, that her worth wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion, and that the best revenge wasn't proving others wrong, it was proving herself right. That the strength she thought she lacked was already there, waiting to be discovered. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Proud of you, sis. Coffee later? I want to hear about the restaurant project." I smiled and typed back. "Proud of us both. See you at 3. And for the first time in years, I truly was. Proud of the woman I had become, proud of the relationship we were rebuilding, proud of the life I had created on my own terms. The story of humiliation and betrayal had become a story of empowerment and self-discovery. I was finally free, not from my past, but from the power I had given it to define me. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility and anchored in the unshakable knowledge of who I was and what I was worth. I was finally home in my own life,